This is my true story. I once thought fatherhood meant watching your child grow, succeed, and come home again. But sometimes love leaves you waiting longer than you ever expect. 20 years ago, my son buried a small box behind our house. He said it was a secret between us, something to open one day. That day never came. He grew up, disappeared, and silence replaced laughter. I never touched the soil, never broke the promise. But last year, I dug it up, and what I found inside made my heart stop. Before I tell you, please subscribe so more people hear my story. 20 years earlier, the world had been softer, slower, and full of small joys that didn't need to be explained. The backyard was their kingdom, a place built not from wealth, but from time spent together. The grass was always uneven, the air always smelled of soil and summer rain, and the laughter of one small boy filled every corner. His son was his reason for waking up early, for working longer, for smiling at things that once felt ordinary. He wasn't just a child, he was hope in human form, curious, fearless, and full of questions that only a father could answer. The boy loved building things, even with his bare hands. Forts made from old planks, toy cars that never ran straight, and small wooden boxes for his treasures. The father had taught him how to measure, how to hammer without hitting his thumb, and how to take pride in even the smallest creations. On weekends, the two of them spent hours outside beneath the young oak tree that grew at the back of the yard. That tree became their witness, to growth, to laughter, and to the kind of love that doesn't need words. One afternoon, under the glow of late summer light, his son came running out of the house, clutching a small tin box and a rusted shovel. His shoes were untied, and dirt smudged across his face. The boy announced that he was going to bury something important, something secret. The father, amused, leaned on the porch railing and watched quietly. The child dug with purpose, his little hands working fast, as if the world would end before the hole was ready. Then he placed the box in the ground, patted the soil back, and stood proudly, as if he had just hidden a kingdom. That evening, as the sun sank low, the boy spoke softly before bed, telling his father not to dig it up until he was grown. The father chuckled at the innocence, never knowing how much that promise would matter one day. It seemed like one of those simple father-son moments you forget after a while, like a crayon drawing taped to the fridge or a toy left behind on the carpet. But some memories never fade. They root themselves deeper than the trees that grow beside them. Years passed, and the oak tree grew tall. Each season wrapped its branches in new life, just as the boy grew into a young man. The father watched it all from the same porch, remembering that tiny patch of soil beneath the roots. Sometimes he'd wonder what might be inside the box. Maybe a toy soldier, a drawing, or a few childish words scrawled in pencil. He never asked. Promises between father and son are sacred, and breaking them feels like breaking time itself. As his son entered his teenage years, the garden grew quieter. The laughter faded, replaced by the thud of slammed doors and the hum of distant music. The boy who once ran barefoot through the grass now spoke in sighs and short replies. The father understood. Life was pulling him forward, just as it should. But still, when he walked past that oak, he'd glance toward the base of its trunk and smile. The secret was still there, sleeping quietly beneath the earth, waiting for a day that felt further and further away. When his son left for college, the morning was bright but heavy. The father stood by the car, waving until the dust on the road settled. Then he turned back toward the house, toward the oak that swayed in the warm wind. He placed his hand on the rough bark and whispered something only the tree could hear. That day, he made himself another promise. He would never touch the ground where the box was buried. Not until his son came home. Not until they could open it together. Years blurred into decades. The backyard aged just as he did. Paint peeled from the fence. The porch creaked. But the oak still stood tall and watchful. When loneliness pressed against him, the father would sit beneath it, feeling the cool earth beneath his palms. He would close his eyes and almost hear his son's laughter again, light endless, carried by the wind. He didn't know that buried beneath him wasn't just a box. It was a heartbeat frozen in time, a memory wrapped in rust and silence. It would stay there for 20 long years, waiting for a moment when life and loss would meet again. And when that day finally came, the ground would tremble, the air would still, and his breath, the breath he'd held for decades, would finally leave him. Time, like wind, has a way of smoothing the edges of everything, even the sharpest memories. The years that followed the day his son buried that box behind the oak tree unfolded quietly, almost too gently to notice what was being lost. Life took on a rhythm of work, meals, and silent evenings. The boy who once filled the yard with noise and wonder began to change, as all children do. He grew taller, spoke less, and learned the art of leaving things unsaid. The father had expected distance to come eventually. That's what growing up meant, chasing something bigger, finding your own ground. But what he didn't expect was how quickly silence could replace laughter. The calls became shorter, the visits rarer, and the space between them wider. Sometimes, months passed without a word. When the father did hear his voice, it was over the phone, distracted, polite, and hurried. Each conversation ended with the same promise. "I'll come by soon, Dad." Soon became later. Later became never. Still, he kept the garden alive. The oak tree had grown thick and powerful, its branches reaching far across the yard, casting shadows that shifted with the sun. The spot beneath it, where the box was buried, remained untouched. Each time he mowed the grass, his eyes lingered there. He never stepped too close, as if doing so would betray a vow made to the boy who had once looked up at him with pure trust. Over the years, the father found comfort in routine. He fixed things around the house that didn't need fixing. He polished the same furniture, repaired the same fence, and kept a cup of tea ready at 4 o'clock every afternoon, the same time they once sat together after school. The chair opposite his always stayed empty. The boy became a man, then a businessman. There were newspaper articles, photos online, and brief mentions from old neighbors about his success. "Your son's done well," they would say with admiration. The father would nod and smile, pretending to share their pride. But inside, pride had long ago turned into a quiet ache. Success was a stranger's story when told without presence. Years turned into decades. Birthdays came and went. Some remembered, most forgotten. The father learned to stop expecting phone calls. He grew used to writing cards he never posted, setting extra plates at Christmas that stayed clean. The box behind the house remained buried, waiting like a heartbeat in the soil. He sometimes wondered if his son even remembered it existed. Yet no matter how much time passed, he could never bring himself to dig it up. The box had become more than just a childhood relic. It was a symbol of a promise that once connected them, a bridge between who his son used to be and who he had become. Opening it alone felt like admitting that bridge had crumbled. So he waited. There were days when he'd sit beneath the oak, his hand resting on his cane, and feel the ground hum faintly beneath him. Perhaps it was the wind. Perhaps it was memory. He imagined his son as a boy again, running barefoot through the grass, calling out for him to join the game. He'd close his eyes and hear it so clearly that for a second he'd forget the weight of years pressing against him. But when he opened his eyes, the yard was empty. Only the rustle of leaves remained. In those long, lonely years, the buried box became both comfort and curse. It represented everything pure that once was, and everything lost that could never return. He had built his life around the hope that one day his son would come home, smile that same crooked smile, and say, "Shall we dig it up now, Dad?" But the seasons rolled on, and the only thing that grew was the tree, tall, unyielding, and silent. He began to understand that love can survive distance, but it struggles under silence. And yet, he couldn't let go. Each passing year was a layer of soil over that memory, pressing it deeper, making it harder to unearth. But he told himself one thing, every evening as he looked out at the yard. If the box still waits, maybe he still remembers me. He didn't know that the day would come when he'd finally hold that box again and discover that his son had never truly forgotten him. Not in the way that mattered. Silence is a strange thing. It doesn't arrive all at once. It creeps in slowly, wrapping itself around the walls of a home until even the clock sounds too loud. That's how the years after his son's departure felt. The father still woke up early, made tea for two, and opened the curtains wide, expecting to hear a familiar voice call from the stairs. But the house stayed still. The son's laughter, once echoing through the hallways, had long dissolved into the hum of passing seasons. The oak tree outside had grown enormous now, its roots thick, its trunk scarred by time. Birds nested in its branches, leaves scattered across the porch like forgotten letters. It had been 20 years since the day his son buried that box. The father often found himself staring at it from his window, not out of curiosity anymore, but from habit. That small patch of earth had become a living monument, not of what was inside it, but of what he had lost. The neighbors sometimes asked about his son. At first, he'd smile and say, "He's busy, working somewhere abroad." But as the years passed, the lie began to feel heavier than the truth. The truth was, he hadn't heard from him in years. No calls, no letters, no visits, just silence. It was as if the boy had been swallowed by the world he once dreamed of conquering. Rumors drifted through the small town like dry leaves in the wind. Some said his son had moved overseas and started a business. Others whispered that things hadn't gone well, that he'd lost everything in a deal gone wrong and left the country in disgrace. The father didn't believe any of it, but each rumor stung a little, like salt on an old wound. He didn't need proof of his son's success or failure. All he wanted was his voice. Even a single message saying, "I'm okay, Dad," would have been enough. But nothing came. Not for years. The garden changed with every passing season. Spring brought blossoms that he no longer had the strength to admire. Summer burned bright, but felt empty without laughter. Autumn covered the yard in gold and red, while winter pressed everything under a blanket of frost. Life moved on, even when he didn't. The old man's back bent, his hands shook, but his memory stayed sharp, especially when it came to that box behind the house. Every now and then, when the wind blew strong enough, he'd think he could hear the faint sound of digging, the echo of that summer day when the boy buried his secret. It was as if the earth itself was whispering, "It's still here. It's waiting." But he didn't move. Not yet. Some promises, even unspoken ones, feel sacred. There were nights when loneliness became unbearable. He'd sit by the fireplace with an old photo album, running his fingers over his son's childhood pictures. A smile here, a scraped knee there. Birthdays, school days, small triumphs captured in fading color. Each page felt heavier than the one before. Sometimes he'd talk aloud without realizing it. Not to anyone in the room, but to the memory of the boy who once swore he'd never leave his father alone. The silence began to take shape, not as emptiness, but as presence. It filled the house, the air, the very rhythm of his days. It became a companion, cruel but constant. He stopped expecting phone calls. He stopped checking the post. He even stopped correcting people when they asked, "You live alone, don't you?" He simply nodded. But somewhere deep down, beneath all that acceptance, hope still flickered. It lived quietly, like a dying candle that refused to go out. He told himself that maybe one day, before he died, he'd see his son's car pull into the driveway again. Maybe they'd sit under that oak, share a cup of tea, and laugh about old times. And maybe, just maybe, they'd finally dig up that little box together. He didn't know it yet, but that hope wasn't foolish. The world has a strange way of returning what time tries to steal. And one day, with the sound of a shovel breaking the soil, the silence would finally end. Not with words, but with discovery. It happened on a quiet autumn morning, the kind of morning where the air carries both chill and memory. The old man had gone out to trim the garden, something he rarely had the strength for anymore. The sun sat low behind the clouds, casting a soft golden hue across the yard. The oak tree, that silent witness to years gone by, stood taller than ever, its shadow stretching across the cracked path like a memory reaching out. He bent slowly, shears in hand, and for the first time in decades, he noticed something familiar beneath the fallen leaves. A faint mark, barely visible but unmistakable, the soft dip in the soil where his son had once dug. He froze, his breath caught in his chest as the world around him fell silent. The birds, the breeze, the rustle of leaves, all faded. It was as if the earth itself was whispering to him, calling him to remember. He stood there for several minutes, staring at the spot. His mind drifted back 20 years to a summer day filled with laughter and sunlight. He could still see his boy, young, energetic, eyes full of promise, holding that small metal box, insisting that one day, when he was grown up, they would open it together. That memory, buried like the box itself, came alive in that single moment. Something inside him stirred, a voice that said, "It's time." He set the shears aside and fetched a shovel from the shed. His knees ached, his back protested, but determination outweighed the pain. Every push of the shovel into the soil felt like unearthing more than just dirt. It was unearthing years of silence, of waiting, of love that had gone unanswered. The sound of metal striking earth echoed through the quiet morning, rhythmic and steady. With each layer removed, the air seemed to grow heavier. The ground smelled of wet leaves and time, a scent that reminded him of the past, of youth, of things unfinished. Sweat rolled down his temples, but he didn't stop. When the shovel finally hit something solid, he paused. His hands trembled as he knelt down, brushing away the dirt with slow, deliberate care. There it was, the box, rusted around the edges, worn by rain and roots, but still whole. A relic of another life. For a long moment, he just stared at it, afraid to touch it. Part of him wondered if he was ready, if opening it would bring comfort or another kind of pain. What if the box held nothing but the echo of what once was? What if it reminded him only of everything he had lost? He sat back on his heels, breathing heavily, the shovel lying beside him. His heart pounded, not from exertion, but from emotion. Then slowly, he reached out and lifted it. The metal was cold, heavier than he remembered, as if the weight of 2 decades had settled inside it. He brushed the dirt away with his sleeve, his eyes misting. For a second, the old man smiled, a small, trembling smile that belonged to the father he once was. He carried the box to the porch and set it on the small wooden table beside his chair. The garden lay silent behind him, the shovel still standing in the ground like a monument. The sun had broken through the clouds, a thin beam of light landing directly on the box, as though the universe itself was watching. He sat there for a long time, staring at it. Memories flooded back, the laughter, the tiny hands clutching his, the sound of his son's voice saying, "Don't open it until I'm grown up." His eyes filled, and a tear slipped down his cheek. After years of waiting, he was finally ready. Not to find what was inside, but to face what he had been avoiding. The truth that love, no matter how far it drifts, always leaves traces behind. The box was a bridge to that truth. With a shaky breath, he whispered to himself, "Let's see what you left behind, my boy." Then, with hands that had held both the world and its losses, he reached for the rusted lid, and the past, buried for 20 years, prepared to breathe again. He placed the rusted box on the porch table, its weight pressing against the wood as if time itself refused to let go. The light shifted through the trees, flickering across his trembling hands. For a long moment, he simply stared at it. There was something sacred about it, a relic buried by love and retrieved by longing. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, then gently pried open the lid with the edge of an old screwdriver. The metal creaked, protesting after years of silence. Then, with a soft snap, the past breathed out. Inside was a small world, preserved in dust. The first thing he saw was a folded piece of cloth, one of his old handkerchiefs, neatly tied around a bundle of small items. He untied it carefully, his eyes scanning what lay inside. A tiny wooden car he had carved for his son's 5th birthday, a marble they once argued over during a game, and a crumpled photograph of the two of them standing beside the oak tree, smiling. The edges were worn, but the warmth of that moment still lived within the fading colors. Beneath those items were several letters, folded tightly, wrapped with a piece of string. His breath hitched as he reached for them. The top one had his name written in that same uneven, childlike handwriting he remembered helping his son practice. His fingers shook as he untied the string, revealing the first envelope, yellowed but still intact. On the front, in faint pencil, were the words, "For Dad, when you miss me." His heart skipped a beat. He could almost hear his son saying it, the innocent lilt in his voice, the boy who once believed forever was just a promise away. He unfolded the paper slowly, each motion deliberate, reverent. The first line read, "If you're reading this, Dad, it means I've gone somewhere far. Don't worry, I'll come back stronger. I just want you to remember that I love you, even if I can't say it every day." The handwriting was shaky, the words simple, but they hit like a hammer to the chest. He pressed the paper against his heart, closing his eyes. The years between then and now seemed to disappear. He could smell his son's childhood on that page, the mud, the paint, the innocence that time had stolen. Beneath that letter were more, each one sealed, each one dated in a different year. He picked them up one by one, but stopped before opening another. Instead, he sat back in his chair, holding the first letter close. Tears rolled down his cheeks, silent and unrestrained. For 20 years, he had carried guilt for losing his son to distance, for not trying harder to reach him. But here, in his trembling hands, was proof that love hadn't been lost, only buried. The sun dipped lower, the golden light turning soft and warm, bathing him in memory. A soft wind rustled through the leaves, brushing against the open box as if nature itself were sighing with him. He noticed for the first time that the letters weren't alone. Beneath them, under a small layer of dust, was a piece of cloth wrapped around something heavier. He hesitated, the curiosity in his chest tempered by fear. He unwrapped it and found a small silver pocket watch, the very one he had lost decades ago, the one his son used to play with, fascinated by its ticking sound. The glass was cracked, the chain rusted, but when he turned the crown, it still ticked faintly. One heartbeat every second, steady and alive. It was as though the past had kept breathing all along. He set the watch beside the letters, hands trembling. The ticking filled the quiet, blending with the whisper of leaves. For the first time in years, the silence in his heart felt different, not empty, but full. He looked at the box again and smiled softly. What his son buried wasn't treasure or secrets. It was love, sealed in time and wrapped in hope. And now, sitting under the same tree that had witnessed it all, the old man realized something profound. His son hadn't just left behind memories. He had left a message that survived everything: distance, failure, and silence. As the last of the daylight faded, he whispered under his breath, not to the wind, but to the boy he still carried within his heart. "I found it, son. I found you." The rusted box sat open beside him, no longer a secret of the past, but a bridge between what was lost and what was finally found. The sun had almost disappeared behind the horizon when the old man finally gathered the courage to unfold the first letter. The light was dim now, the kind that softens the world and makes memories feel closer. His fingers trembled as he slid the paper out, careful not to tear the fragile edge. The ink had faded slightly, but the handwriting, his son's handwriting, was still unmistakable. Uneven, a little messy, but full of heart. He could almost see the boy sitting cross-legged on the floor decades ago, tongue between his teeth as he wrote, concentrating on every word like it was a secret meant for eternity. The first line stopped him cold. If you're reading this, Dad, it means I'm far away. But I want you to know, I'll always come back." His throat tightened. The words carried a kind of innocence that only children have, a belief that no distance, no mistake, could ever undo love. He read it again, slower this time, each word pressing deeper into the cracks of his heart that time had carved open. The letter went on to talk about small things, a list of what the boy loved about their days together. "I love how you always fix the swings when they squeak. I love how you make toast with honey on Sunday mornings. I love that you never get mad when I lose my shoes." The old man smiled through the tears. Those words weren't just sentences. They were snapshots of a life that had once been simple, pure, and full. Near the bottom of the page was a drawing, two stick figures holding hands beneath an oak tree. One had a tall hat. That was him. The other had messy hair. That was his son. Above them, written in shaky capital letters, were the words, "Me and Dad forever." His chest tightened. He had forgotten that drawing, yet the moment he saw it, he remembered everything: the summer breeze, the laughter, the smell of cut grass. They had drawn it together that afternoon, after planting flowers near the same oak tree where the box had been buried. The paper felt alive in his hands, carrying not just ink and lines but warmth, laughter, and an echo of a promise. He pressed the letter against his chest, closing his eyes. It felt like his boy was there again, running barefoot through the yard, calling out to him, asking him to play. The years between them vanished, and for a few minutes he wasn't an old man sitting alone with a rusted box. He was a father again, holding on to his son's words like a heartbeat. As the wind rustled the branches, he felt something shift within him. For 2 decades, he had carried guilt, believing his son had forgotten him, that distance had replaced love. But this letter proved otherwise. His son hadn't left out of hate. He had left with hope, carrying a love so deep that he buried it to last longer than their years apart. The old man looked at the oak tree, its branches heavy with leaves, and whispered softly to himself, "You kept your promise, son. You came back, in words, in memory, in me." The tears that followed were not bitter. They were the kind that wash away regret and leave behind something gentler: acceptance. He sat there for a long time, watching the paper flutter slightly in the breeze, the ink glinting faintly in the dying light. Then he carefully placed the letter back in the box, beneath the pocket watch and the marble. His hand lingered for a moment before pulling out the next sealed envelope, this one dated a few years later. He stared at the date. It was written during the time his son was supposed to be at college, a time when their calls had already begun to fade. His pulse quickened. This one was newer, written by a man, not a boy. He could feel it in the weight of the envelope, but before opening it, he took one last look at the first letter and smiled through the ache in his chest. The sun had fully set, leaving the yard bathed in the soft blue of twilight. The oak tree swayed gently, as though nodding in approval. The old man took a deep breath, wiped his eyes, and whispered to the night, "All right, son, I'm ready for the next one." With trembling hands, he reached for the second letter, unaware that what he was about to read next would shatter everything he thought he knew about why his son had left and what he had buried behind that house all those years ago. Night had fallen fully now. The air was still, carrying the faint scent of rain that hadn't yet arrived. The old man sat in the soft glow of the porch light, the open box before him, and the second envelope resting gently in his palm. His eyes traced the handwriting, older, steadier, familiar, yet changed. It wasn't the scrawl of a child anymore. It was the writing of a man who had lived, lost, and learned. The date on the front made his stomach twist. 10 years after the first letter, long after his son had vanished without a word. He hesitated, the envelope trembling slightly in his hands. For 2 decades he had wondered why his son never came home, why the calls had stopped, why silence had replaced every promise. Now, it seemed, the answers lay inside that single fold of paper. Slowly, he tore it open and unfolded the letter within. The first line hit him harder than any storm. "Dad, I came back when I lost everything." His vision blurred instantly. The words swam before his eyes as he struggled to breathe. He continued reading. "I couldn't face you. I failed in everything I tried. Business, love, myself. I didn't want you to see me like that, after everything you gave me. I came home one night, but you were asleep. I walked to the oak tree, dug up the box, and read the old letter I wrote you as a boy. It broke me, Dad. I realized I'd buried my best self here, the part of me that believed I could make you proud." The paper shook in his grasp. He could picture it now. His son standing in the dark, under the same tree, covered in regret and rain, too ashamed to knock on the door. The thought tore at him. For years, he had cursed the silence, never imagining it came from love, twisted by guilt. The letter continued. "I added something to the box tonight. I don't know if you'll ever find it, but I hope you do. I've started over somewhere else. I have a daughter now. She reminds me of Mom. I'll tell her about you one day, about the man who taught me everything good I know." His hands froze. Beneath the letter, tucked into a smaller fold, was a photograph, faded but clear enough to see his son standing beside a young woman holding a baby. They were smiling, but not at the camera, at each other. It was a picture of a life rebuilt quietly, painfully, beautifully. His thumb traced the small face of the baby, his granddaughter. He'd never even known she existed. A small note had been scribbled beneath the photograph. "Her name is Lily. If she ever comes here, tell her I was once better than my mistakes." The old man broke. Tears streamed freely down his face as he clutched the picture to his chest. The weight of all those empty years came crashing down, not in anger, but in sorrow for the time both of them had lost. He whispered into the night, voice trembling, "You came home, son. You did." He stared at the oak tree through the darkness, its branches swaying gently, as if the earth itself was mourning with him. The truth had been buried for 20 years, just like the box, hidden not out of cruelty, but out of fear. His son hadn't abandoned him. He had only been waiting for forgiveness he thought he didn't deserve. For a long while, the old man didn't move. The letter rested on his lap, the photo pressed against his heart, the pocket watch ticking faintly beside him, steady, constant, alive. Somewhere between the tears and the wind, he realized something quietly profound. He hadn't lost his son to distance. He had lost him to shame. And now, through this fragile piece of paper, he had finally been found again. He took a deep breath, folded the letter carefully, and placed it back in the box beside the first one. His trembling hand lingered over it, as if sealing a wound that had waited decades to close. For the first time in years, his chest felt lighter. The silence didn't hurt anymore. It hummed with meaning. The boy, who once buried a secret behind that house, had left behind more than memories. He had left the truth, waiting patiently underground for his father to be strong enough to face it. And tonight, under the dim porch light, that truth had finally risen. The night grew colder, the moonlight spilling across the yard in a pale shimmer that reached the old oak tree. The man sat there motionless, the photograph of his son and granddaughter trembling in his fingers. The truth he had uncovered, beautiful, devastating, and long hidden, sat heavy on his chest. His son had been alive. He had come home. He had buried not just childhood treasures, but confessions, regrets, and love that had never been spoken aloud. For years, the father had blamed distance, time, and pride. But now he realized what truly kept them apart was silence, the cruelest kind of wall built between hearts that still cared. His body ached as he tried to stand. The shovel leaned against the porch, still dirty from the dig. The sound of crickets filled the air, soft and rhythmic, as if the earth itself was whispering a lullaby to the past. He pressed the photo to his heart and looked toward the tree. It felt alive again, not just bark and branches, but a monument of memory. He thought of his son returning here in the dead of night, broken and ashamed. The idea made his chest tighten. He imagined the rain falling on that night long ago, soaking his son's hair, the shovel hitting wet earth, the trembling hands folding the letter. His boy had been standing only a few feet from the window where he slept, alone, unaware that his child was so close. If only he had woken up. If only he had heard him cry. If only he had opened the door. The what-ifs came rushing in, thick and suffocating. The old man's knees gave way, and he sank slowly to the ground. The photograph slipped from his hand and fluttered down beside him. For a long moment, he simply stared at it. His son's smile, the light in his eyes, the little girl in his arms. The air felt too heavy to breathe. His heart pounded, uneven and raw. Decades of pain, regret, and longing rose like a wave inside him, and when it broke, tears poured freely down his cheeks. He whispered through the sobs that racked his body, words meant for no one but the night. "You didn't have to hide, son. You never had to hide." His voice cracked, the sound small but full of years. The wind stirred the leaves, carrying the words away. It almost felt like the tree answered back with a soft rustle, a sound like comfort. The ache in his chest deepened, but it was no longer sharp. It was something gentler, something human. He realized then that his son's shame wasn't cruelty. It was love that had curdled under the weight of failure. His boy hadn't wanted forgiveness. He had wanted to protect his father from disappointment. It was the kind of mistake only someone raised with too much pride and too much love could make. The old man sat there until his breathing steadied. He picked up the photograph again and kissed the corner gently. Then, with slow, deliberate care, he placed it back into the box beside the letters. His trembling fingers closed the lid. The rusted metal groaned softly, like the sound of closure. He looked up at the sky. The stars shimmered faintly through the branches. Somewhere, far away, his son might still be alive, or maybe not. He didn't know, but it no longer mattered. He had found what he'd been searching for all along, the truth, the proof of love that never really left him. He pulled himself up with the help of the porch railing, his body weak, but his spirit strangely calm. As he stepped inside the house, he glanced back at the oak tree once more. It stood tall and silent, guarding its secret no longer. That night, when he went to bed, he placed the photograph and the pocket watch on the table beside him. The faint ticking filled the quiet, steady impatient, like a heartbeat reminding him that life, no matter how broken, goes on. Before closing his eyes, he whispered one last time into the darkness, "You came home after all, son. You found your way back." The tears came again, but softer now, like rain on dry soil. They didn't hurt anymore. They healed. The man finally fell asleep with the box by his bedside, and the weight of 20 years finally lifted. The morning sunlight crept through the curtains, painting the room in a soft golden hue. The old man woke up with a stillness that felt different, not empty, not heavy, but settled. For the first time in decades, the ache in his chest wasn't sharp. It was gentle, like a bruise that had finally begun to fade. The box sat open on the table beside him, the letters and photograph neatly arranged inside. It no longer looked like a relic of the past. It looked like something living, proof that love, no matter how buried, never truly dies. He made his morning tea slowly, his movements careful but deliberate. Every sound, the clink of the cup, the rustle of the leaves outside, the chirp of distant birds, felt louder, fuller, as though the world itself had shifted ever so slightly. He carried his cup to the porch and looked out toward the oak tree, its branches reaching out like arms in greeting. For 20 years, that tree had guarded a secret. Now it stood as a monument to revelation. The day before, he had dug up the past. Today, he was learning how to live with it. He brought the box to his lap and opened it once more, fingertips brushing over the letters. He reread the first line from his son's second note, "I came back when I lost everything." This time, the words didn't sting. They comforted him. His son hadn't buried the box to hide from him. He'd buried it to leave behind hope, a message, a memory, a bridge between the man he had been and the father he had always loved. As he sat there, He realized he didn't want this story to end in sorrow. He wanted it to mean something, for himself and for others who might one day sit alone, wondering where love had gone. So he made a quiet decision. He went inside, found a clean notebook, and began to write. Not with the weight of guilt, but with purpose. Every day he would write a letter of his own. One to his son, one to his granddaughter he'd never met, one to life itself. He didn't care if anyone ever read them. The act of writing felt like breathing again, a way to turn pain into presence. The first letter began simply, "My boy, I found the box, and I found you in it." His words flowed easily. He told his son about the house, the seasons that had passed, the silence that had taught him patience. He wrote about forgiveness, not as something to be given, but something to be shared. He ended the note with a sentence that came from deep within him. "You buried memories under the oak, but I dug up forgiveness in the same place." When he finished, he folded the letter carefully and placed it inside the box beside the others. That simple act, adding his own piece to the story, felt like closing a circle. Father and son were together again, not in presence, but in peace. The following week he went into town. He visited a small frame shop and asked the young clerk to mount the letters and photo together under glass. The clerk didn't ask questions, just smiled kindly as he worked. When the old man brought it home, he hung it in the living room, right above the fireplace. It wasn't decoration, it was a legacy. Every visitor who came by paused to look at it. Some asked what it meant. The old man always answered with a small, knowing smile. "It's a story about promises that take time to keep." Days turned into weeks. The house didn't feel as silent anymore. He began tending to the garden again, trimming the bushes, feeding the birds, and sitting by the oak tree every evening. Sometimes he spoke softly to the wind. Other times, he just listened. The earth beneath the tree seemed lighter, almost breathing with him. He often imagined that somewhere out there, his son was doing the same. Maybe sitting with his daughter, telling her stories of a man who once built tree houses and fixed swings that squeaked. Maybe one day, that little girl, Lily, would find her way here, following her father's words, and see the letters for herself. The thought didn't make him sad. It filled him with something deeper. Hope, the kind that comes not from what's lost, but from what's left behind. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of orange and gold, the old man whispered to the air, "You gave me a gift, son. You gave me back my heart." And the wind that passed through the leaves seemed to carry a voice back, faint, familiar, and warm, as if the world itself was answering. "I never took it from you, Dad. I only buried it where you'd find it when you were ready." Years passed quietly after that day. Seasons changed around the old oak tree, each one leaving a trace of time, fallen leaves, spring blossoms, fresh grass. The father had grown slower, but not weaker. His hand still trembled when he touched the letters, yet the sadness that once lived behind his eyes had softened into something peaceful. He no longer waited for his son to come home. He had already found him, in ink, in memory, in forgiveness. He often sat by the window during sunrise, the framed letters catching the morning light. Visitors sometimes asked why he kept them displayed. He would smile faintly and say, "Because that's where time stopped and started again." The letters weren't reminders of pain anymore. They were proof that love doesn't vanish. It just finds new ways to speak. He had learned to fill his days with simple joys, the smell of fresh soil after rain, the sound of the kettle whistling, the birds gathering by the window for crumbs of bread. Sometimes, he wrote in his notebook, reflections, memories, and notes for Lily, the granddaughter he'd never met. He wrote as if she might one day walk through that door, curious about the grandfather who lived beneath the oak tree. "Dear Lily," one of the letters began, "your father wasn't perfect, but neither was I. What matters is that we never stopped loving each other, even when we forgot how to show it." He sealed each note carefully, placing it in a small box beside the one his son had buried long ago. One day, both would be hers, a bridge between generations that never truly broke. The townspeople came to know him as the quiet man who tended to the oak every morning. Children would ask about the tree, and he'd tell them, "It's a family tree, not the kind you draw, but the kind you grow." Some days, he caught himself talking to the tree out loud, thanking it for keeping it secret until the right moment. He no longer saw it as just a part of his garden. It had become part of his soul. There were nights when he would sit on the porch with a blanket, looking at the stars, wondering where his son might be. If he was still alive, if Lily was safe, if their lives had found peace like his had. He didn't pray for reunion anymore. He prayed for understanding. He knew now that not all love stories end with return. Some end with release. As time went on, his health began to fade, but he didn't fear it. He often told the neighbors, "I'm not leaving anything behind. Everything that mattered has already been found." His words puzzled them, but he meant it. His life had already come full circle the day he dug up that box. One evening, as dusk colored the sky, he went outside with a cup of tea. The air was warm, the kind that holds the scent of old memories. He looked at the oak tree and whispered softly, "You've done your part, old friend." Then, with slow hands, he buried his last letter beneath its roots, one addressed to both his son and Lily. It read, "If you ever come home, dig here again. You'll find love waiting, just like I did." He covered the spot carefully, his heart steady. This time the box didn't carry pain or secrets. It carried peace. Now, as an old man nearing the end of his days, he often tells his story to anyone willing to listen. His voice is calm, his eyes glimmering with the weight of memory and the light of acceptance. "My son buried a box," he says, "but what he really buried was our second chance. I just had to wait long enough to find it." He pauses, always at the same point, as though the words themselves are sacred. Then he adds, almost as a whisper, "Love doesn't die with distance. It just hides until we're ready to dig it back up." When the wind blows through the oak leaves, it sounds like quiet applause, nature's way of agreeing. And under that tree, where the first box sleeps beside the second, the story of a father and a son continues, buried in earth, but alive forever in the hearts they left behind.